Close your eyes for a moment. Picture this. Today, there are more than 8 billion humans wandering around Earth. We build skyscrapers that scrape the sky, order tacos with a single tap, and argue about pineapple on pizza like it's a matter of national security. But 900,000 years ago, there were fewer humans alive than students in a single high school. About 1,280 of them. That's it. One bad cold, one unlucky volcano, one saber-toothed cat with an especially good day, and poof, no you, no me. No awkward office icebreakers. It's wild to think about. Our entire species dangled over the edge of extinction for 117,000 years. That's not a bad weekend. That's more than 100,000 years of barely hanging on, while the climate played extreme makeover, Apocalypse Edition. And yet, somehow, against all odds, a tiny population of scrappy, hungry, probably very smelly humans survived. They lived through droughts, ice ages, predators, and each other's morning breath. And from them, from this microscopic thread of survivors, came everyone you've ever known, loved, or disliked on the internet. Tonight, we're going to drift back into that world. A time when survival meant fire wasn't just cozy, it was life. When cooperation wasn't optional, it was oxygen. And when your neighbors weren't annoying, they were essential. Get comfortable. Pull up a blanket. Maybe grab some snacks. Your ancestors could only dream of Oreos. Anyone? Because where we're going, food options include roots, beetles, and more roots. This is the story of the day humans faced extinction and almost lost. Close your eyes and let yourself drift into the quiet thought of scale. Right now, as you listen to this, there are over 8 billion people alive on Earth. That's 8 billion voices talking, laughing, crying, and let's be honest, occasionally yelling at each other in traffic. It's a number so large, it's almost impossible to wrap your mind around. It's stadiums filled 100,000 times over. It's cities that glow like constellations from space. It's humanity stretching into every corner of the planet, from the skyscrapers of Tokyo to the fishing huts of Alaska, from the markets of Lagos to the coffee shops of Melbourne. We are everywhere. Now, imagine shrinking that number down. Imagine if, instead of billions, you counted and you didn't even make it to 1 million, or 100,000, or even 10,000. Imagine if the entire human population could be packed into a single town. Not a big town, either something the size of a small rural high school in the middle of nowhere. Around 1,280 people. That's it. No, I'm not missing a zero. 1,280. At one point in deep prehistory, that's all there were. To put it in perspective, picture every single person you know, family, friends, co-workers, the barista who knows your coffee order better than you do, and then realize that, in this ancient moment, that little circle of people might have represented 1% of the entire human population. You could probably memorize everyone's name in existence if you were really dedicated. Family reunions would have been the global census. It's both terrifying and strangely intimate. Terrifying because one well-placed asteroid, one megavolcano, or even one particularly ill-tempered saber-toothed cat with an appetite could have erased us completely. Intimate because it meant humanity wasn't some sprawling, anonymous mass. It was a fragile handful, clinging to survival like a candle flame in a storm. Imagine the responsibility those early people unknowingly carried. The genetic future of every artist, every inventor, every teenager, making TikToks in their bedroom. All of it compressed into the lives of fewer people than you'd find in a Costco on a Saturday afternoon. And here's where it gets funny, if you tilt your perspective just right. Humans today argue about which city has the best pizza, or which version of Star Wars is the real one, or whether pineapple belongs on pizza at all. But back then, the argument might have been whether that root is edible, or whether you should eat the beetles first, or save them for later. Fewer people, fewer arguments, but each one mattered so much more. You couldn't just storm off after a fight and never talk to someone again. If you did that, there was a 1 in 1,000 chance you had just ended contact with 1% of the human race. It would be like boycotting your neighbor and realizing, oh no, I may have just destabilized the global dating pool. But jokes aside, think of the razor's edge they lived on. When you're 8 billion strong, you can afford disasters. A storm wipes out a city, and while tragic, the species continues. A disease spreads, and medicine and sheer numbers absorb the blow. But with only 1,280 humans on Earth, you don't get second chances. Every accident, every drought, every predator encounter is magnified into something potentially catastrophic. It's like playing a video game with just one life. No respawns, no save points, just the long, uncertain path forward. And yet, against every odd, those people made it. They survived. Their DNA stretched, filtered, and shuffled over thousands of generations lives inside every single one of us today. You carry the proof that humanity once shrank to a whisper, and yet the whisper persisted. If you ever feel small, if you ever think your life doesn't matter, remember this. You are part of the unbroken chain that refused to snap when everything said it should. It is called a near miss in evolutionary terms, but that phrase feels almost too clinical. It was closer to a miracle. If those 1,000-something individuals had been a little less resourceful, a little less cooperative, or just a little less lucky, you wouldn't be here. There would be no history to study, no civilizations, no songs or bedtime stories, no podcasts, or YouTube sleep videos. The Earth would have rolled on without us, and maybe the raccoons would be in charge by now. Frankly, looking at how raccoons behave around garbage cans, it's best we survived. When you think about it, 8 billion feels less overwhelming and more miraculous in this context. 8 billion people alive today, all sprouting from a root that once looked ready to wither. It's like a tree that grew from the smallest, driest seed imaginable. A seed that, for a time, looked doomed, and yet here it stands, with branches stretching across the whole planet. If you ever needed a bedtime story of resilience, this is it. You are proof that sometimes the most fragile threads hold strongest. And so we begin the tale of how humanity, reduced to fewer than 1,300 individuals, dodged extinction by a hair's breadth and gave rise to the world you know today. Now, the question naturally rises: how in the world did humanity get squeezed down to such pitiful numbers? The answer isn't glamorous. It wasn't a single asteroid, or an alien invasion, or even a bad decision involving too many mammoth steaks at once. The culprit was climate. Planet Earth decided to shuffle its settings, and it didn't choose the pleasant springtime option. It went straight for, let's see how many species I can test at once. Around 900,000 years ago, the planet's climate flipped into chaos. Before this time, ice ages came and went in a predictable rhythm. 40, 1,000 years of cooling, then warming, then back again. Annoying perhaps, but survivable. Early humans and animals could adapt to that tempo, but then something shifted in Earth's orbit and atmosphere. Suddenly, instead of neat 41,000-year cycles, the planet started swinging between warm and cold every 100,000 years. And the cold wasn't just chilly, it was monumental, with glaciers that swallowed continents, sea levels dropping hundreds of feet, and weather patterns breaking apart like old furniture. For early humans in Africa, where we know the bottleneck happened, this was catastrophic. Africa didn't get buried under glaciers the way Europe or North America did, but it paid the price anyway. The rainfall patterns that once brought seasonal abundance collapsed. Rivers dried, woodlands withered. What was once lush and green shriveled into dry scrub, and eventually into lifeless desert. Imagine being part of a small human group, watching the landscape transform year after year, until the places where your parents found food and water turned to dust. Your grocery store aisle didn't just run out of bread. It turned into sand dunes. The brutal dryness wiped out animals too. Herds of antelope, elephants, and other large game dwindled, unable to survive without water. And when the animals go, the predators go too. Lions starve, hyenas vanish, and humans, who relied on hunting and scavenging, suddenly found themselves with fewer options than a picky eater at a salad bar. Now picture the population pressure. Small human groups wandering across regions that once supported thousands, now reduced to a handful of watering holes. Conflict would be unavoidable. Groups competing over the same patch of river, tensions flaring over access to tubers and insects. Imagine the awkwardness of running into your prehistoric neighbors at the only functioning spring. You'd have to negotiate, share, or fight. And fighting was dangerous when every life mattered. This grinding climate pressure didn't last just a season or two. It stretched on for tens of thousands of years, an endless drought punctuated by colder and colder glacial swings. For humans, it meant entire generations lived and died in scarcity, with no memory of anything different. When children asked, "Will it rain next year?" the answer was usually no. Genetic evidence suggests that during this time, humanity shrank down to around 1,280 breeding individuals. That's not just a census number, it's the fingerprint of survival written into our DNA. When populations shrink, genetic diversity collapses. Our DNA today still carries that scar, like a faint echo of the catastrophe. Compared to chimpanzees, who live in scattered communities but still maintain incredible genetic variety, humans are startlingly uniform. We're all variations on the same small deck of cards, shuffled again and again since that bottleneck. The technical term scientists use is the extinction vortex. Once a species falls below a certain threshold, it usually doesn't climb back out. Inbreeding becomes common. Diseases spread more easily. Random accidents, like a flood or fire, can wipe out entire groups. Species caught in the vortex don't just struggle, they vanish. And yet, somehow, humans didn't. Maybe we were clever enough, maybe cooperative enough, maybe just absurdly lucky. Probably all three. Humor helps cushion the weight of it. Picture an ancient human couple, squinting at their meager fire, realizing they might be the only people for miles. "Honey," one says, "what if we're the last two left?" "Then I guess we better really get along," replies the other. Jokes aside, that grim possibility was very real. Each small group had no way of knowing if others still existed. Scattered across Africa, huddling near the last scraps of water. But this is how the Great Crisis unfolded. The climate turned hostile, food sources vanished, and our species shrank to a fraction of its former numbers. Not because we were weak, not because we were careless, but because the world itself went through one of its harshest transformations. Nature rolled the dice, and humanity almost didn't make the cut. And so the stage was set for our ancestors' desperate resilience. Learning to squeeze calories out of insects, figuring out fire, passing on knowledge, and somehow finding ways to keep the fragile thread of humanity unbroken. The why of our near extinction is climate. The how of our survival, that's the story still unfolding. When you picture extinction, your mind probably goes to something cinematic. Dinosaurs gazing up at a glowing asteroid the size of Manhattan, a mammoth sinking dramatically into a tar pit while ominous music plays in the background. But extinction doesn't always arrive in one spectacular, Hollywood-worthy moment. Sometimes it creeps in silently, step by step, until a species finds itself caught in what scientists call the extinction vortex. And once you're in that spiral, the odds of climbing back out are about as slim as finding free Wi-Fi in the middle of the Sahara. So, what exactly is this vortex? Imagine a bathtub drain. Once the water level drops too low, the current picks up, and everything swirls down faster and faster. Small populations work the same way. When your numbers get too low, problems compound. Fewer individuals mean fewer genetic options. Fewer genetic options mean higher chances of inbreeding. Inbreeding means defects, vulnerabilities, and, frankly, some awkward family gatherings. Layer on diseases, accidents, and bad weather, and soon you're swirling downward in a spiral that almost no species escapes. This was the terrifying reality for humans around 900,000 years ago. With only about 1,280 breeding individuals left, we were right at the lip of that drain. To understand how precarious it was, imagine today's world. 8 billion humans. That means if one group faces a disaster, a hurricane, an epidemic, a badly timed disco comeback, there are plenty of others to keep the species going. We're buffered by sheer numbers. Now shrink that 8 billion down to fewer than 2,000. Suddenly, every lightning strike, every broken leg, every "oops, I ate the wrong berry" moment matters. One unlucky day could wipe out 5% of the species. That's like if you walked into a Costco and everyone inside represented humanity, and one spilled jar of pickles took out the dairy aisle, and with it, the genetic future of humanity. Genetics is where the vortex really digs in its claws. In a large population, variation is plentiful. Some people have blue eyes, some brown, some green. Some are resistant to one disease, others resistant to another. The gene pool is like a giant salad bar, messy, varied, maybe even overwhelming. But in a tiny population, that salad bar shrinks. Suddenly, you're down to iceberg lettuce, a few tomatoes, and the sad olives nobody touches. With fewer options, harmful genes stick around. Traits that might have been harmless in a large population become devastating in a small one, and then comes inbreeding. It's not exactly something our ancestors wanted, but with only a few potential partners, it was inevitable. It's like being at a school dance where only 20 people showed up, and 10 of them are your cousins. Not great for genetic health. Inbreeding increases the chance that recessive diseases usually lurking quietly in the background suddenly come to the forefront. Infertility, birth defects, weaker immune systems, all of these rise when the dating pool gets too small. And in a population that already has fewer than 2,000 members, every failed pregnancy or unhealthy child is another tug toward the drain. The extinction vortex doesn't stop with genetics, though. It's also about randomness. In science, they call this demographic stochasticity, but you can think of it as really bad luck. Imagine a thunderstorm wiping out one band of humans camped near a river. In today's world, tragic but manageable. In a world of 1,280 humans, that might have been 3% of the species, gone overnight. Or consider disease. A virus sweeping through a large population may knock out thousands, but survivors carry immunity and pass it on. In a tiny group, a virus can simply kill everyone. End of story. Random disasters hit small populations like sledgehammers. Now add environmental variability to the mix. Droughts, floods, temperature swings, all normal parts of Earth's climate. In a large population, there's wiggle room to ride out the bad years. But when you're already teetering, a few failed rainy seasons can starve entire bands of people. No backup, no relief trucks, no helpful neighbor with extra canned goods. Just silence where a group used to be. This spiral is why the human bottleneck is so extraordinary. Most species that fall below a few thousand individuals never recover. They vanish, leaving behind only bones and mysteries. The fact that we didn't is almost absurd. We should not be here. Every calculation, every model suggests humanity should have gone the way of the dodo, except we didn't. Something kept us afloat. Maybe it was our knack for cooperation, maybe our ability to invent solutions, maybe just sheer stubbornness, maybe it was all three. Whatever it was, those 1,280 survivors resisted the pull of the vortex long enough to rebuild. And here's where you can breathe a little sigh of relief. Because as you listen to this, maybe snuggled under blankets or letting your eyes get heavy, remember, your DNA carries proof of this improbable victory. You are here because somehow, impossibly, our ancestors fought the vortex and won. Picture Africa, 900,000 years ago. Not the lush savannas with wildebeest herds and grazing giraffes you might imagine, but a land unraveling under the weight of climate change. The rains grew fickle, then stopped altogether. Rivers shrank to muddy scars across the land. Grasslands browned, cracked, and blew away as dust. It wasn't a desert overnight more, like a slow suffocation. Every year, a little less green, a little less life. It was as if the entire continent was exhaling and forgetting how to breathe in again. For humans alive then, it was like living in a house where the walls were closing in. You'd wake up one season to find the stream you relied on had gone dry. A few years later, The berry bushes you depended on for food wouldn't bloom anymore. The animals, antelopes, elephants, zebras migrated away or died off. With each passing decade, the land grew quieter. You could walk for days and not see a herd, not find a patch of edible roots, not hear the chatter of birds overhead. It was emptiness, stretching mile after mile. Imagine trying to raise a family in this shifting dust bowl, your children asking for water, and you leading them to the only spring left, only to find it claimed by another band of humans, equally desperate. Sharing might keep everyone alive, but it might also leave everyone too weak. Fighting could give you water, but cost lives you couldn't spare. Every decision was a gamble. The land itself conspired against survival. Winds picked up loose soil, filling the air with grit that stung eyes and scoured skin. Food became so scarce that diets expanded to things that would make a modern person gag. Insects by the handful, bitter roots, anything with calories. Fire became a treasure, not just for warmth but for making the inedible edible. Without fire, half of what little was left couldn't be eaten. And think of the psychological toll. In a world where food and water are abundant, people can afford dreams, rituals, maybe even a little art. In a dust bowl, there's no room for leisure. Every sunrise meant another day of hunting for scraps, another day of wondering whether tonight you'd sleep with a full stomach or not at all. Sleep itself would have been fitful stomachs growling, children restless, predators prowling the edges of camp in search of equally desperate meals. But even in such bleakness, humans adapted. They became masters at reading the land. A faint green line on the horizon might mean underground water. The call of a bird could hint at a nearby spring. People learned to memorize every tree, every rock, every seasonal stream, because forgetting could mean death. We know from geology that Africa was locked in cycles of aridification during this time. Vast regions that once supported thriving ecosystems turned barren. Fossils of animals vanish from the record because they simply couldn't survive. And alongside those gaps in the fossil record, human traces vanish too. No bones, no tools, just silence. The dust swallowed entire chapters of history. What little remains suggests that humans endured by clinging to refuges, maybe highlands where rain still fell, or valleys with hidden aquifers, or coastal edges where the sea provided fish when the land gave nothing. These places became lifeboats in a continental sea of dust. Without them, humanity would have disappeared entirely. If you've ever walked across a hot parking lot in summer, feeling heat rising through your shoes, multiply that by 1,000, and imagine it stretching horizon to horizon. That was life in the Dust Bowl. And yet, against every hardship, those fragile bands of humans found ways to continue. They were tougher than we can imagine, more resourceful than we give them credit for. So, as you drift further into sleep, think of those ancestors navigating a world where the landscape itself seemed determined to erase them. Their survival is written in your very bones, proof that even in a dust bowl that seemed endless, life found a way. If you've ever complained about not knowing what to make for dinner, just remember you've never had to stand in a barren, wind-swept plain where the only things on the menu are roots, beetles, and maybe a lizard if you're lucky enough to catch it. Today, we fuss over takeout options. Thai or pizza, sushi or burrito. Our ancestors would have been thrilled if even one of those words meant something to them. For them, dinner was less about choice and more about survival roulette. Spin the wheel, and maybe you find a rabbit. Or maybe you spend the night chewing on grass seeds and hoping they don't give you stomach cramps. The prehistoric pantry wasn't glamorous. Imagine being part of a small human group 900,000 years ago. You wake up hungry because, well, you went to sleep hungry too. The first priority of the day is not Instagram, not coffee, but finding calories, anything with enough energy to keep muscles moving and brains thinking. And calories didn't come in neatly wrapped packages. They came in forms we'd consider unappetizing, but which for them were delicacies. Insects, for instance, were staples. Termites, ants, beetle larvae. High in protein, easy to gather, and crunchy in a way that modern snack companies might market as primal chips. Termite mounds, those towering mud castles dotting the savannah, were all-you-can-eat buffets. People would poke sticks inside, lick off the wriggling harvest, and call it a meal. Not glamorous, but if you're living on the edge of extinction, you don't get picky. The six-legged menu item might not sound appealing, but it kept bodies alive and brains fueled. And let's be honest, compared to some of the things we snack on today, fluorescent cheese dust, for example, bugs might have been the healthier choice. Roots and tubers were another survival staple. These weren't the clean, buttery potatoes of a modern dinner plate. They were gnarly, bitter things buried deep in dry soil. Digging them up was sweaty, back-breaking work, often yielding little more than a lump that tasted vaguely like sadness and dirt. But those lumps carried carbohydrates, and carbohydrates kept hearts beating. Sometimes people would gnaw them raw. Other times, if fire was available, they'd roast them, turning bitterness into something slightly more edible. This wasn't fine dining, but it was the thin line between life and death. Occasionally, fortune smiled, and meat appeared on the menu. Not supermarket cuts wrapped in plastic, but whatever could be caught, scavenged, or stolen from predators. Early humans weren't always mighty hunters. Sometimes they were opportunistic thieves. Picture a pride of lions finishing their kill, bellies full, wandering off. Along came a group of humans, nervous but determined, with sharp stones and wooden sticks. They'd wave, shout, maybe throw rocks, and if the lions didn't object too strongly, they'd snatch the leftovers half-gnawed bones, scraps of flesh, marrow to be sucked out. Risky? Absolutely. But in a world where every calorie counted, marrow and scraps meant life. Fish and shellfish, where available, were rare luxuries. Along rivers or coasts, people figured out that water carried food too. They'd scoop fish with woven baskets, pry shellfish off rocks, or even trap eels in clever weirs. A feast by prehistoric standards, rich in fats and oils that nourish developing brains. It's almost poetic. The same fish oils that nutritionists nag us about today, omega-3s, brain food, were probably part of what kept those tiny populations sharp enough to survive. And then there were eggs. Bird nests, turtle nests, anything with an egg inside was fair game. Picture a group of early humans stumbling upon a clutch of ostrich eggs, each one as big as a bowling ball. Enough calories to feed a family for a day. They'd crack them open and share the contents. Not scrambled with cheese, of course, but eaten raw or roasted in the coals of a fire. Prehistoric brunch, no mimosas included. Plants filled the gaps. Seeds, berries, fruits, when available. But Africa during the bottleneck wasn't generous. The environment was harsh, the seasons unpredictable, and many plants were toxic if eaten raw. Humans learned, slowly, painfully, which plants could be eaten safely and which ones could kill. This knowledge became precious, handed down carefully. A mistake could wipe out a family, but a discovery like finding a way to process a bitter root into food could sustain generations. It's worth noting that hunger reshaped everything about their relationship with food. Meals weren't social events. They were survival milestones. Every bite was a victory. Every day with full bellies was a reprieve from extinction. And hunger shaped ingenuity. It taught humans to experiment, to push boundaries, to innovate. Without desperate hunger, maybe nobody would have figured out how to cook with fire. Without scarcity, maybe nobody would have learned to crack bones for marrow or grind seeds into paste. The strange prehistoric menu didn't just keep people alive, it made them clever. So when you hear someone complain about kale salads or oat milk lattes, remind them, our ancestors would have traded an entire termite mound for either. Their menu was strange, desperate, and limited, but it was enough to keep a fragile species alive long enough to become us. And that makes every beetle, every bitter root, every half-gnawed lion scrap, part of the greatest feast in history, the feast that saved humanity. Now, let's move from the desperate menu to the invention that transformed it all. Fire. If food was survival, fire was magic. Imagine being one of the first humans to see flames dancing not in a terrifying lightning strike that set the forest ablaze, but under your control, in your hands, on your terms. fire wasn't just a tool. It was warmth on frozen nights, protection against predators, and maybe most importantly, the first nightlight in history. Think of the fear before fire. Darkness fell, and that was it. No lamps, no candles, no glowing screens, just blackness, pierced by the occasional rustle of something moving out there. You'd lie awake, stomach rumbling, listening to the growl of hyenas, the pad of a leopard's feet, the cough of a lion. Night wasn't peaceful. It was terrifying. And then came fire. Suddenly, the night wasn't a wall of fear. It was a circle of light. Flames cracked and popped, throwing warmth and security. Predators, wary of heat and sparks, kept their distance. For the first time, humans could relax after dark. Fire became a shield, a fragile but powerful barrier between fragile bodies and the teeth of the world. But fire was more than safety. It transformed food. Remember those bitter roots? Throw them on the coals, and they softened, their starches breaking down into sweet, edible calories. Meat, once risky to eat raw, became safer, tastier, more nourishing when cooked. Parasites and bacteria burned away in the flames. Nutrients unlocked. Suddenly, the same foods that had been just barely edible became meals that fueled bigger bodies, sharper minds. Fire didn't just make dinner better, it made humans better. Some scientists argue that cooking with fire is what allowed human brains to grow larger. More calories, more efficiently digested, meant more energy for thinking. In other words, without campfires, you wouldn't be here listening to this story. Fire also created time. Before, night was dead space. Darkness fell, and work stopped. With fire, humans could stretch the day. They could sit together around the flames, repairing tools, sharing stories, planning hunts. They could pass knowledge down to children, not in frantic whispers during daylight hours, but in long conversations beside the glow. Fire extended, not just the hours of activity, but the hours of connection. In a way, it created culture. And let's not forget warmth. Ice Age nights could kill without warning. Fire meant survival when temperatures plunged. Families could huddle around the flames, warming stiff fingers and toes, thawing water into drinkable liquid, keeping frost from creeping into their lungs. Fire was life when the air itself turned hostile. Of course, fire wasn't easy. Keeping it alive required constant vigilance. Coals had to be tended, embers protected. One careless moment and the flame went out, leaving people in the dark with no matches, no lighters, no easy way to start it again. Fire was so precious that some groups carried embers with them, wrapped in bark or moss, like sacred treasures. To lose fire was a catastrophe. To keep it was triumph. Imagine the first jokes told around the fire, the first stories, the first songs. Imagine children falling asleep to the crackle of flames instead of the growl of predators. Imagine the relief of eating cooked meat after years of choking down raw scraps. Fire was more than survival. It was comfort. It was community. It was, quite literally, light in the darkness. And so, when you sit by a fireplace today, or light a candle, or even flip on a lamp, you're echoing that first, miraculous discovery. The invention of the prehistoric nightlight changed everything. Without it, humanity might have remained just another anxious primate, shivering in the dark, too afraid to sleep. With it, we became something more: storytellers, thinkers, dreamers. Fire gave us warmth, food, time, and the beginnings of civilization. And in that glow, humanity found its spark. Imagine living in a world where everyone you meet looks suspiciously like your uncle. And not just because of a strong family resemblance, but because, well, they might literally be your uncle. That was the reality of life 900,000 years ago, when humanity was whittled down to a sliver of existence. Survival wasn't about 8 billion strangers scattered across continents. It was about 30 or 40 people huddled together, sharing fire, food, and gossip. The gossip, of course, would have been limited to a few topics, since everyone already knew everything about everyone else. There's no privacy when your entire world is one extended family. Life in these tiny groups was a strange mix of cooperation and claustrophobia. On one hand, you absolutely needed each other. Hunting, gathering, tending fires, raising children, none of it could be done alone. On the other hand, imagine the awkwardness of trying to survive with the same 30 people, day in and day out, for your entire life. No escape, no vacations, no meeting new friends at summer camp. Just the same circle of familiar faces, every single sunrise. But small groups weren't just a consequence of limited numbers. They were also a strategy. Bands of around 20 to 40 people were the sweet spot. Large enough to share responsibilities, small enough to stay mobile. When the environment gave little, a group that was too big would starve. A group that was too small couldn't defend itself or gather enough food. So, humanity settled into this Goldilocks arrangement. Not too big, not too small, just enough cousins to cover all the chores. Cousins, of course, is a generous term. In reality, everyone was related in more ways than anyone could track. The concept of family tree would have looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot of vines. Your aunt might also be your half-sister, your brother might technically also be your cousin twice removed, and your grandparents might double as your distant in-laws. Keeping track of who was who would have been a nightmare, so people probably didn't bother. Everyone was family. That was simpler, if not less awkward. And yet, for all the closeness, there was strength in these cousin bands. Survival depended on an unspoken contract. Share or die. If someone hoarded food, the group suffered. If someone failed to help gather firewood, the group froze. Conflict wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. So groups developed ways to smooth tensions. Joking, teasing, rituals, maybe even song and dance. Humor was a pressure valve. Even then, picture a prehistoric version of family game night, except the stakes were keeping the group cohesive enough to face down hyenas. Children were everyone's responsibility. With so few adults, parenting couldn't be left to one or two people. Everyone pitched in feeding, carrying, teaching. A child didn't just belong to their parents, they belonged to the band. And in a world where every new baby represented another thread of survival, each child mattered deeply. Every small face around the fire was hope embodied. Of course, that didn't eliminate tension. Resources were tight, and people got cranky. Imagine the stress of divvying up a single ostrich egg among 30 people, or negotiating whose turn it was to keep the fire alive during the night, or settling disputes when someone borrowed your digging stick without asking. Even small annoyances could spark big emotions. But unlike today, storming off in a huff wasn't an option. There was nowhere else to go. Every disagreement had to end in resolution, because splitting the band could mean death for both halves. This dynamic of closeness and necessity forged something unique. Humans learned to read each other like books. Facial expressions, tones of voice, gestures. People became experts in anticipating moods and smoothing over conflict. After all, when the survival of your children depended on whether your cousin would share her tubers tomorrow, it paid to know when she was grumpy. Out of these daily negotiations, the roots of empathy and cooperation grew. So yes, life in small cousin bands was awkward. It was crowded, it was tense, and sometimes it probably felt like an eternal family reunion that nobody could leave. But it was also the forge in which human social intelligence was tempered. Our ability to cooperate in groups of millions today began around those tiny campfires, where 30 people worked out how to live together, forgive each other, and keep going in a hostile world. It was messy, imperfect, and deeply human. And every one of us carries the echoes of those cousin bands in the way we still crave community, still bicker like siblings, and still tell stories around our modern fires, whether they're campfires, TV screens, or glowing phones in the dark. Now let's address the elephant in the cave. Or maybe, the cousin in the bedroom. When your entire species has fewer people than a modern cruise ship, things get complicated. To put it bluntly, the dating scene was bleak. Forget Tinder, Forget awkward coffee dates. In those days, your romantic options were whoever wasn't already raising children with you. And even then, chances were they shared some branch of your family tree. Scientists call this inbreeding, and while the word carries all sorts of uncomfortable baggage today, back then, it was simply unavoidable. With only around 1,280 humans on the planet, spread thinly across Africa, it wasn't a question of if, but how much. Everyone looked a little too familiar because, genetically, they were. That meant marriages of convenience were often marriages of necessity. A distant cousin? Good enough. An uncle's daughter? Works fine. A second cousin twice removed? Jackpot. The problem with inbreeding is that it doubles down on genetic quirks. Every one of us carries recessive genes, little genetic stowaways that don't cause trouble unless they meet their twin in another parent. In a large population, the odds of two carriers pairing up are slim. In a tiny, shrinking species, those odds skyrocket. And so, certain issues, birth defects, reduced fertility, weaker immune systems, would have cropped up again and again. Babies born too weak to survive. Adults falling prey to illnesses their bodies couldn't fight. Every tragedy further squeezing the fragile species toward that dreaded extinction vortex. And yet, somehow, humanity pushed through. It's tempting to imagine that every family gathering was a chorus of coughs and complaints, but reality was more nuanced. Inbreeding didn't doom humanity, it simply raised the stakes. Each new baby was a gamble. Some inherited bad luck, others inherited resilience. Over time, survival itself became a filter. Those who endured passed along whatever genes gave them strength. Slowly, painfully, the population adapted. We see the legacy today. Compared to other primates, humans are shockingly uniform genetically. Chimpanzees in different regions of Africa are more diverse from each other than you are from a stranger halfway around the world. That uniformity is the scar of our near extinction and our history of inbreeding. We're all closer cousins than we'd like to admit, which, if you think about it, is oddly comforting. Every handshake, every smile across a street, is a reunion of distant relatives who once shared an ancestor in a band of survivors. Humor helps soften the edges. Imagine two prehistoric teenagers sneaking glances at each other across the fire. Their parents exchange an awkward look. "Well," the dad mutters, "at least he's only your third cousin." The mom sighs. "We'll take it." Romance wasn't about choice. It was about keeping the fire of humanity burning, one awkward pairing at a time. And yet, this closeness bred more than just genetic issues. It bred community. When everyone is family, bonds are stronger. Caring for the sick, supporting the young, sharing knowledge, it wasn't altruism, it was survival strategy. Helping your cousin wasn't just kindness, it was an investment in the future of the group, and by extension, the species. So while inbreeding created problems, it also carved resilience. It forced cooperation, demanded adaptability, and, against every odd, it worked well enough to carry us through the bottleneck. The awkward truth is that every human alive today carries echoes of that genetic closeness. We are, in a very literal sense, one big family. Every laugh, every tear, every bedtime story traces back to those awkward romances in the dust of prehistory. So the next time you feel like humanity is hopelessly divided, remember, we all descend from the same tiny circle of survivors who once looked around, shrugged at their limited options, and decided to keep going anyway. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't ideal, and sometimes it was uncomfortably close for comfort, but it was enough. And enough is what saved us. When humanity was dangling by the thinnest of threads, survival didn't come from sharper teeth, thicker fur, or faster legs. Compared to the predators stalking the ancient plains, humans were underdogs. A lion could sprint, a leopard could leap, a hyena could crush bone with its jaw. What did we have? Awkward running form, fragile bodies, and a knack for sunburns. If life were purely about brute strength, our story would have ended before it really began. But we had something else, something subtle, almost invisible. We had each other. Cooperation wasn't just helpful, it was our hidden superpower. Imagine a small band of early humans, 30 or so, moving across a dry savanna in search of food. Alone, each one would have been pitiful. A single person digging for tubers could feed themselves for the day, maybe, if they were lucky. A lone hunter trying to take down a gazelle might succeed once in a while, but usually they'd end up with nothing but sore feet and hungry stomachs. But put people together, and something changed. 3 people digging could feed the whole band. 10 people with sticks and stones could scare lions away from a carcass. A group working in shifts could keep a fire alive through long, cold nights. What no individual could accomplish alone, the group made possible. This wasn't instinctive, at least not at first. Cooperation had to be learned, practiced, refined. People had to figure out that helping a cousin today might mean getting help tomorrow. Sharing food meant fewer calories for you in the moment, but it meant everyone in the group lived, and that meant protection. When danger came, knocking. The math of cooperation was simple. Alone you die, together you might survive. And slowly, over hundreds of generations, this math reshaped human behavior. But survival didn't just depend on sharing food and chores. It depended on sharing knowledge. In a world where one wrong plant could poison you, where one forgotten trail could lead to thirst and death, knowledge wasn't trivia. It was currency. And unlike food, knowledge grew more valuable the more it was shared. When someone figured out that a certain root needed roasting before it was edible, telling others didn't diminish their own advantage, it magnified it. Now the whole band had more to eat. When one hunter learned the signs of a watering hole hidden behind hills, everyone who heard the story benefited. This constant flow of information turned humans into a network species before Wi-Fi was even a glimmer in the evolutionary eye. Imagine evenings around the fire. One person describes the way clouds had formed before yesterday's rainfall. Another tells of finding bird tracks that led to a nest. A third demonstrates how striking 2 stones together made a sharper edge. These weren't idle chats, they were survival briefings disguised as stories. Every word passed along knowledge that could save lives. And here's where the superpower emerges. Most animals are limited in how they share information. A monkey can scream a warning when a leopard approaches. Bees can dance to show where nectar lies. Useful, but narrow. Humans develop the ability to communicate in detail, to share abstract ideas, to pass information across not just space but time. Parents taught children, elders guided the young. Stories preserved lessons from one generation to the next. This wasn't just sharing, it was building a library in living memory. Cooperation made the group stronger day to day. Knowledge sharing made it stronger across centuries. Together, they became a kind of evolutionary cheat code. Lions could hunt alone with brute force. Humans hunted together with strategy. Leopards could rely on instinct. Humans relied on collective memory. When you don't have claws, you invent plans. When you can't outmuscle your enemies, you outnumber them with teamwork. And when you can't guarantee your children will face the same conditions you did, you give them knowledge flexible enough to adapt. Of course, cooperation wasn't always easy. People got jealous. Someone might feel another wasn't pulling their weight. Disagreements flared. But the need to survive forced humans to smooth those edges. Groups developed rituals to reinforce bonds. They shared meals, told jokes, sang songs, danced, and performed simple ceremonies. These weren't luxuries. They were glue, sticking people together when hunger and stress might otherwise drive them apart. A laugh shared around the fire wasn't just entertainment, it was insurance that tomorrow, when danger appeared, that same cousin would have your back. That's why anthropologists today argue that cooperation and storytelling were as important to survival as stone tools or fire. They created social glue strong enough to hold fragile groups together through 100,000 years of scarcity. That glue is still in us. It's why we form families, clubs, nations. Why we cheer at sports games, even if we don't play. Why we bond over TV shows and memes. We're addicted to belonging, because belonging once saved us. So if you've ever felt the warmth of laughing with friends, or the relief of being helped when you were struggling, you've touched the same force that carried our ancestors through the bottleneck. cooperation, and shared knowledge were our first superpowers. Not flashy, not violent, not glamorous, but effective enough to keep a tiny, fragile species alive long enough to become the world's most dominant animal. That's the power of glue you can't see, but you can feel. Imagine being a prehistoric parent. No baby monitor, no pediatrician, no corner store stocked with formula. Just you, your fragile child, and a world filled with danger. Every cough could mean death. Every stumble near a fire could be fatal. And food? You couldn't just puree some carrots from the grocery store. You had to find those carrots first, dig them up, test them, and pray they weren't poisonous lookalikes. Parenthood in those days wasn't a Hallmark commercial. It was a daily battle for survival. In such a world, teaching wasn't optional. It was the single most important thing a parent could do. Passing on skills and knowledge wasn't about grades or career prospects. It was literally the line between life and death. A child who didn't learn to recognize safe plants might not live past their first attempt at foraging. A teenager who couldn't start a fire might freeze to death on their first solo night. Forget algebra and violin lessons. Prehistoric homeschooling was all about tool-making, tracking, and don't eat that berry. Trust me. Teaching began from the moment children could toddle. A toddler stumbling through camp wasn't just cute. They were a sponge, soaking up critical knowledge. They watched their parents strike stones together, weave baskets, sharpen sticks. They copied, fumbled, got corrected. Small hands learned to dig for tubers, to crack nuts with rocks, to carry embers without burning fingers. Every lesson was a survival tutorial. Fail the class, and there was no retake. But this wasn't just parental pressure. It was community investment. Children were everyone's responsibility. A group of 30 or so couldn't afford to lose even one young life. Every child represented the future of the species. That meant every adult was a teacher in some way. A grandmother might show how to find water by watching bird flight. An uncle might demonstrate how to spot animal tracks in dust. A cousin might help a child practice throwing a spear. Knowledge wasn't hoarded. It was distributed across the group, stitched into the rhythm of daily life. Teaching also meant storytelling. Imagine children gathered around a fire, eyes wide as an elder recounted the tale of someone who ate the wrong mushroom and never woke up. That wasn't just a scary story, it was a survival manual. Myths and parables became code books, compressing vital information into memorable narratives. The spirit of the river punishes those who drink from stagnant pools was a poetic way of saying, don't drink dirty water. Stories made lessons sticky in young minds. This relentless need for teaching shaped human evolution. Unlike most animals, which rely heavily on instinct, humans relied on culture. A bird doesn't have to teach its chick how to build a nest. The skill is hardwired. A wolf pup doesn't need a lecture on hunting. It just follows the pack. But humans were born helpless, with brains wired for flexibility rather than fixed behaviors. We didn't inherit survival skills in our DNA. We inherited the capacity to learn them. And so, our survival hinged on our ability to teach. That's why childhood lasted so long. Human kids take years, even decades, before they're fully independent. It's exhausting for parents, but it gave children time to absorb mountains of cultural knowledge. The long dependency period wasn't a weakness. It was an evolutionary strategy. More time for teaching meant more skills passed on, which meant greater chances of survival when those children became adults. The endless why questions of children today are echoes of this ancient system. Curiosity wasn't annoying. It was essential. Humor had its place. Even then, parents probably teased clumsy kids learning to throw spears, much like we laugh when a toddler tries to catch a ball and misses by a mile. But behind the laughter was urgency. That child needed to learn. A missed spear in practice could mean starvation in adulthood. A forgotten rule about water could mean disease. Parenting was equal parts love, pressure, and desperate hope. The legacy of this survival parenting still shapes us. Schools, apprenticeships, bedtime stories, they all stem from the ancient truth that teaching saves lives. We evolved to be obsessed with passing on knowledge. It's why grandparents light up when telling old family stories. It's why kids soak up games, songs, and language so fast. It's why education feels so deeply human, because it is. Without it, humanity would have vanished in the dust 900,000 years ago. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of those parents and children huddled around flickering fires, mothers showing daughters how to roast roots, fathers guiding sons in shaping stone blades, elders weaving tales thick with warnings and wisdom. Each lesson was a lifeline, cast across the abyss of extinction. Each child who learned was another step away from the edge. Survival parenting wasn't glamorous, but it was sacred. It kept humanity alive long enough for you to be here, listening to this story. Close your eyes and imagine a world before gadgets, before wheels, before even the simple concept of a handle. There were no spoons, no scissors, not even a humble paperclip to fiddle with during boring meetings. In that stark prehistoric landscape, the difference between survival and starvation often came down to what you could do with the nearest rock. And not just any rock, oh no, the right rock, the perfect balance of hardness and shape. Because while animals had claws and fangs, humans had stones. It's almost funny when you think about it. The grand story of human innovation begins not with fire-breathing genius or glittering cities, but with people crouched in the dust, bashing two rocks together like confused toddlers at play. And yet, that simple act, whacking a stone against another until it fractured just right, produced the first tools, sharp edges that could cut meat, scrape hides, carve wood. The moment those sharp flakes were born, humanity had created something unique. Technology, primitive, clumsy, but revolutionary. Now, if you picture early humans using these tools, don't imagine sleek knives or elegant spearheads. The first creations looked more like shards from a broken dinner plate than anything impressive. And yet, to those who held them, they were treasures. Imagine trying to butcher a deer with your bare hands. You'd end up with sore fingers, blisters, and probably a disappointed family. With a stone flake, suddenly you could slice through hide, separate joints, even crack bones for marrow. That sharp edge turned scavenging into feasting. Over generations, humans refined their craft. They learned to look for specific types of rock flint, obsidian, quartzite. Each had its quirks. Flint was reliable, obsidian was glassy and razor-sharp but fragile. Quartzite was sturdy but harder to shape. Early humans became amateur geologists without even realizing it, scanning riverbeds for promising stones like modern folks scan store shelves for the best avocado. You could almost hear the prehistoric sighs of frustration when someone brought back a crumbly, useless rock. Really, Grog? This is what you found? Might as well cut meat with a sponge. With practice, stone napping, the art of striking rocks to create tools, became a skill passed down. Fathers showed sons, mothers taught daughters, uncles corrected clumsy cousins. It was noisy work too. Clack, 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 echoing across valleys. Sparks sometimes flew, though fire from stone wasn't mastered until later. Every tool was unique, but over time, patterns emerged. Hand axes, shaped like oversized almonds, became the Swiss army knives of the ancient world. You could chop wood, butcher animals, dig for roots, or, if negotiations went badly, wave one menacingly at a neighbor. These tools weren't just practical, they were symbols of survival. To own a sharp stone was to declare, I have power over my environment. It meant no longer relying solely on teeth and nails. It meant reshaping the world to suit human needs. Even if all you were doing was scraping bark, it was a quiet revolution. Technology wasn't about the iPhone launch. It was about the day someone realized that a slightly sharper rock meant dinner tonight instead of hunger. And of course, once you give humans a taste of invention, we never stop. Slightly sharper rocks led to wooden spears tipped with stone. Scrapers led to clothes stitched from hides. Awls led to woven baskets. It was a slow, patient layering of progress, each step built on the lessons of the last. There was no eureka moment, no one caveman shouting, "I have invented the multi-tool." Instead, there were countless quiet evenings of trial and error, a misstrike that shattered a rock, a lucky blow that produced the perfect edge. And then, the excitement of showing someone else how to repeat it. Even humor crept in. You can imagine. Someone botched their tool so badly it resembled nothing useful. The group laughed, teased, and then helped them try again. Failure wasn't just tolerated, it was part of the process. Because in those fragile times, even bad tools were better than none. So when you think about the tools they loved, remember, it wasn't about perfection. It was about possibility. A chipped flake, a crude hand axe, a rough scraper. Each one was a spark of human ingenuity. Each one carried the promise that, little by little, humanity was learning to shape not just stones, but its own destiny. The love of tools began with rocks in the dust, and it never left us. We've just swapped flint for steel, obsidian for microchips, but the feeling is the same. Pride in holding something that makes the world bend just a little closer to our will. If the story of humanity's survival was already improbable, evolution decided to throw in one more plot twist. A genetic accident so strange it still leaves scientists blinking in disbelief. Somewhere around 900,000 years ago, during that long bottleneck when humanity hovered on the edge of extinction, two ancestral chromosomes fused together, just slammed into each other and became one. And this accident changed everything. Now, most people never think about chromosomes unless they're sitting in a biology class. But chromosomes are basically the shelves where DNA is stored. Chimps, gorillas, and orangutans all have 48 of these shelves. Humans, we only have 46. Why? Because two of our ancestors' chromosomes fused together into one giant shelf, now known as chromosome 2. It's like two old library books, getting glued together into a single volume. You can still see the seam today, right there in our DNA, like a scar from an ancient accident. What makes this so remarkable is how rare it is. Chromosome fusion doesn't happen every other Tuesday. It's the kind of event that usually goes nowhere, producing embryos that don't survive. But in the tiny, fragile human population of the time, this oddball change didn't just survive, it spread. And soon enough, everyone in that dwindling group carried it. Today, every single human alive has chromosome 2. It's our genetic signature, a reminder that we are all descendants of that fusion event. And here's where it gets fascinating. Chromosome 2 isn't just a fused shelf. It contains genes linked to brain development. It's possible, maybe even likely, that this accident nudged our ancestors toward greater intelligence. A shuffle in the deck of DNA that gave us more complex wiring upstairs. Think about that for a moment. Every work of art, every joke, every song, every invention from fire to spaceflight might trace back to two chromosomes deciding to merge during one of humanity's darkest hours. Of course, nobody back then knew anything about chromosomes. They weren't sitting around the fire, saying, "Hey, did anyone else notice our genome just rearranged itself?" They just lived their lives, never realizing that deep inside their cells, a change had occurred that would alter the future of the species. For them, the struggles were still the same: finding food, staying warm, avoiding predators. The fusion was invisible, but its consequences rippled silently forward. There's humor in imagining how fragile it all was. What if the fusion had happened in an individual who didn't survive long enough to have children? What if the accident had been lost in the shuffle of extinction? Maybe we'd still be another species of ape, smart but not quite human, chattering in forests instead of building cities. The accident stuck, and here we are, billions of us, all carrying the same peculiar scar in our DNA. Scientists today can point directly to where the fusion happened. Under the microscope, you can see the remnants of two telomeres, the protective caps on chromosome ends, sitting in the middle of chromosome 2, like mismatched puzzle pieces. You can see the doubled centromeres, evidence that two chromosomes once had their own centers but now share one. It's forensic science written in molecules, A crime scene solved nearly 1 million years after it happened. And it's not just about numbers. The fusion may have given humans subtle advantages. Fewer chromosomes meant fewer chances of errors during reproduction. It might have streamlined genetic processes. It may have opened the door to brain growth, language, and abstract thought. A happy accident, born in a moment when survival was least certain. So when you reflect on what makes humans different from our cousins in the animal kingdom, remember, it isn't just our tools, our fire, or even our cooperation. It's also this quirky accident, a genetic stitch that rewired our blueprint. In the quiet of prehistory, without fanfare, 2 chromosomes fused, and the echoes of that moment still shape you as you breathe right now. Every thought you have, every memory, every dream carried on a chromosome that exists because of a 1 in a million accident that stuck. In the end, it wasn't strength or size that saved us. It was persistence, cooperation, and just a touch of luck. At the molecular level, humanity is, in a very real sense, the child of an accident. And somehow, that accident gave us the power to tell stories in the dark, to laugh at ourselves, to imagine the universe, and to wonder how we almost didn't make it at all. Picture yourself sitting beside a fire almost 1 million years ago. Not the cozy kind with marshmallows and a camp chair, but a smoldering pile of branches. You're desperately trying to keep alive, because if it dies, so might you. Around you, people huddle together, thin and hungry, listening to the distant howl of something very large and very toothy. In this bleak setting, your brain becomes the most important tool you own. Not your muscles, not your speed, not even your sharp rock, just the 3 pounds of squishy grey matter inside your skull. And under the crushing pressure of survival, that brain begins to change. It's strange to think about, but our brains did not simply evolve in a steady, gentle arc upward, like a graph drawn by a careful accountant. They ballooned in fits and starts, pushed by crisis, shaped by desperation, and fine-tuned by catastrophe. The bottleneck era was one of those crucibles. Life was so harsh, so relentless, that only those with sharper wits and quicker learning had any real chance. Muscles tire, claws break, but brains can invent, adapt, and anticipate. In the furnace of survival, our ancestors' brains were set ablaze. Consider the challenges they faced. Food was scarce, and hunting required not just courage, but strategy. You couldn't just run at an antelope and hope for the best. You had to anticipate its movements, coordinate with others, plan an ambush. That required memory, imagination, and communication. Each successful hunt was not simply a matter of throwing spears, it was an IQ test graded in meat. Those who passed got to eat, and those who didn't, well, they didn't pass on their genes. Even gathering plants demanded intelligence. In an environment where the wrong tuber could kill you, pattern recognition became vital. Which plants were safe, which were toxic, which only became edible after roasting for hours. People had to remember subtle differences in color, texture, or taste, then pass that knowledge along. Mistakes were costly, and so sharp observation and teaching weren't luxuries. They were survival filters. Brains also grew under the pressure of social living. In a tiny band of cousins, everyone knew everyone's quirks. You had to navigate alliances, soothe tensions, and predict who was likely to share their food and who might not. It's easy to underestimate how complex this was. You can't simply grab the last scrap of roasted root without considering who else had their eye on it. Fights threatened group stability, and instability threatened survival. So people got better at reading faces, sensing moods, and guessing intentions. Psychologists today call this theory of mind, but back then, it was the prehistoric version of customer service. Learn to read the room, or end up outside it, shivering alone. And then there was teaching. Unlike most animals, human survival skills weren't hardwired. They had to be learned, remembered, and improved. That required brains flexible enough to hold onto mountains of knowledge and creative enough to find new ways of solving problems. A clever person who figured out how to store water in a dried gourd could save their band. A sharp mind that learned to tie sinew into rope, or discovered a better way to knap stone, could change the lives of everyone around them. Ideas became survival currency, and the brains that generated and remembered them became prized assets. It wasn't just about being clever. It was about being clever in a world that punished mistakes without mercy. Imagine a prehistoric child who didn't listen carefully to warnings about which mushrooms to avoid. That child wouldn't survive long enough to pass on their genes. But another child, who remembered every lesson and even invented new ones, would not only survive but thrive. Multiply that over thousands of generations, and you get a brain under relentless selective pressure to grow bigger and more capable. Of course, bigger brains came with costs. They're energy hogs, consuming about 20% of the body's calories, even though the brain makes up only about 2% of body weight. That's like owning a tiny, spoiled pet that eats half your groceries. In lean times, this was risky. A body with a large brain had to find enough food to keep it running. But the advantages outweighed the costs. Brains that could solve problems found more food, which fed the brains, which solved more problems. A feedback loop was born, and it spiraled upward. This is why scientists sometimes describe humanity's brain growth as a runaway process. Once intelligence began paying off in survival, it paid off more and more. Bigger brains meant more innovation meant more survival meant bigger brains. The bottleneck turned this loop into a furnace. With so few people left, each survivor had to be sharper, faster, more adaptable. And so the line of humans who survived were the ones whose brains lit up with invention, memory, and imagination. You can almost picture them gathered at night, telling stories not just for entertainment but for survival. A story about the time someone nearly starved, until they remembered where water pooled under a certain rock. A story about the dangers of a plant that made a hunter sick. A story about how to spot the faint glimmer of obsidian in a hillside. Those stories were brains sharing their fire. And in that sharing, the species changed. So when you lie in bed, your thoughts spiraling, your imagination wandering, remember that you are the product of brains on fire. Brains that grew under pressure, forged in scarcity, and tempered in the constant test of survival. Your ability to imagine a future, to recall the past, to laugh at a joke, or to feel moved by a story, all of it traces back to those desperate days when evolution cranked up intelligence. Not because it wanted to, but because the world demanded it. We are, quite literally, the children of crisis. And our greatest inheritance is not claws, not fangs, not speed, but the glowing ember of thought, passed from one brain to another until it became the bonfire of human intelligence. If you've ever been frustrated by a missing puzzle piece, imagine trying to piece together human history when half the box is empty. That's the problem scientists face when studying the bottleneck era. Between about 950,000 and 650,000 years ago, the fossil record goes eerily quiet. Hardly any bones, hardly any tools, hardly any trace of humans at all. It's as if our ancestors packed up, left no forwarding address, and disappeared into the wind. Scientists even call it the fossil gap, which sounds less like an archaeological mystery and more like a disappointing tourist attraction. Come visit the famous fossil gap, marvel at nothing. So why are there so few bones from this time? The first and most obvious reason is numbers. There just weren't many humans alive. When your species has fewer members than a small town, the odds of any one individual's bones being fossilized are astronomically low. Fossilization itself is rare. It requires the right conditions: quick burial, mineral, rich waters, and a lot of luck. Most bones simply rot away. Multiply scarcity of people with scarcity of fossilization opportunities, and you get silence in the record. But scarcity isn't the only explanation. The climate of the time worked against preservation. Africa was drying out, its landscapes turning to deserts and scrublands. Deserts are terrible for fossilization. Bones left on the surface bleach, crack, and crumble. They don't get buried in wet sediments that turn them into fossils. Instead, the wind grinds them down until nothing remains. If you've ever left something plastic outside for too long and watched it crumble, you've seen a pale imitation of what happened to bones in those harsh conditions. Another factor is geography. Many of the refuges where humans might have survived the hidden valleys, lake shores, and riverbanks have since been reshaped by erosion, floods, or tectonic shifts. Entire landscapes have been wiped away or buried under layers of later soil. The bones might still exist, but they're buried so deep or so broken up that finding them is like hunting for a single grain of sand in the desert. And then there's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we just haven't looked in the right places. Archaeology is a little like treasure hunting, except most of the map is missing and the treasure is usually just a fragment of jawbone. Scientists dig where they think conditions were right, but vast areas of Africa remain unexplored. The fossil gap may not reflect total absence, but simply absence of discovery. There could be bones waiting under the soil, quietly keeping their secrets until someone stumbles across them. What makes the fossil gap particularly haunting is that it coincides with one of the most critical chapters in human history. This was the era of near extinction, of survival by a thread, of brains on fire and chromosomes fusing, and yet, the people themselves have almost vanished from the physical record. It's as if history erased their faces but left us their echoes in DNA. Our genes carry the proof they lived. Our bones today are their fossils, walking above ground instead of buried in it. There's humor in imagining an archaeologist's frustration. After years of digging, brushing, and cataloguing, they hold up a rock fragment with a sigh. Not a jawbone, not a femur, just another rock that looks suspiciously bone-like until you squint at it for an hour. The fossil gap is a reminder that history is stingy, and the past does not always leave souvenirs. But the absence itself tells a story. When fossils are plentiful, it means species were abundant. When they vanish, it signals decline. The silence in the record mirrors the silence of dwindling populations. It's not just a gap in evidence, it's a reflection of reality. Humanity was so scarce that it barely left a footprint in stone. And yet, there is something poetic about this. Our ancestors may have vanished from the fossil record, but they didn't vanish from existence. They lived, struggled, ate bitter roots, laughed around fires, and loved their children. They survived without leaving behind bones for us to admire. Instead, they left us their survival itself. Their DNA flows in our veins, a living fossil, a record written not in rock but in flesh. So the fossil gap is not a void, it's a whisper. It reminds us that the story of humanity isn't told only in bones and stones, but in the very fact that you are here, listening to this story. Every breath you take is proof that those unseen, unfossilized ancestors carried the torch long enough to pass it on. And maybe that's the most important record of all. Imagine the Earth 900,000 years ago. From space, it looked familiar enough, a swirl of blue oceans and brown continents, white clouds drifting over the curve of the planet. But on the ground, especially in Africa, the picture was grim. Vast stretches of once green land had withered. Lakes dried into salt flats, forests thinned into brittle scrub, grasslands turned to dust. To the animals living there, it was as if the very stage of life had collapsed beneath their feet. For humans still fragile, still barely scraping by the world, was turning into a giant, no vacancy sign. And yet, scattered across this harsh landscape, there were little patches of hope. Scientists call them refuges small, hidden places where life could still cling. Without them, our story would have ended. A refuge might have been as simple as a river that never ran dry, fed by underground aquifers, or a valley shaded by cliffs, catching rain when the surrounding plains baked, or a coastal zone where tides provided fish, even when the land gave nothing. These weren't paradise. They were narrow margins of survival, small enough that competition was fierce and life was constantly on edge. But compared to the desolate wastelands outside, they were havens. Imagine stumbling across such a place after days of wandering through emptiness. To find water trickling, plants growing, birds singing that would have felt like stumbling into Eden. What made these refuges special was stability. While the broader climate whipped back and forth in extremes, these pockets absorbed some of the shock. Maybe a mountain range forced clouds to drop rain. Maybe a spring bubbled up steadily no matter what the skies decided. Whatever the reason, these microclimates offered continuity when everywhere else was chaos. And continuity was the one thing humans needed most. If the water flowed, if the tubers sprouted, if game animals passed through even sporadically, then the fragile thread of life could hold. You can imagine small groups clustering in these places, clinging together like castaways on a desert island. The rest of the continent might have been uninhabitable. But here, in this valley or on that shoreline, survival was at least possible. People built routines around these landscapes, digging roots near the marsh, fishing in tidal pools, stalking animals that came to drink. They learned the rhythms of their refuge, the way you learn the layout of your own home. Every bend in the river, every tree that held edible fruit, every rock where lizards basked, all memorized, mapped, and woven into survival strategies. But there was no abundance. Refuges were limited, and so was what they could provide. When populations grew too large, tension rose. Too many mouths for too few resources. Sharing wasn't just noble, it was unavoidable, enforced by necessity. Still, competition simmered. Imagine the awkwardness of bumping into another group at your carefully guarded watering hole. Both sides tired, hungry, clutching sharp rocks. Would you fight? Would you negotiate? Would you split the resources and hope everyone survived another week? The politics of survival were written in sand and water. It's easy to think of refuges as lucky spots, and in some sense they were, but luck was only part of it. Survival in those niches required ingenuity. People had to know where to dig for hidden tubers, how to time fishing trips with the tides, how to conserve energy when food was scarce. They had to adapt rituals and stories to keep memory alive. Every discovery, a new plant, a hidden cave, a clever trap, wasn't just useful, it was salvation. Knowledge turned a refuge from a temporary rest stop into a long-term home. The miracle is that these little sanctuaries were enough. They carried us through tens of thousands of years of scarcity. Without them, humans would have faded from the earth, leaving nothing behind but a few fossilized teeth for future creatures to puzzle over. But with them, the tiny population held on. They were like embers hidden under ash. Small, faint, vulnerable to being snuffed out, but with enough potential to blaze again when conditions improved. So the next time you sip water from a tap, or walk along a coastline, without a thought for where your next meal will come from, remember the refuges. They were the secret corners of Earth that held us safe, the quiet pockets where humanity huddled during its darkest nights. Without those hidden oases, there would be no us, just silence, where our story might have been. Survival, in the bottleneck era, wasn't neat and tidy. It wasn't as if one heroic band of humans huddled together in a single valley and endured for 100,000 years until the climate eased. Life was messier, crueler, more unpredictable. Groups rose and fell like sparks from a fire. One band might thrive for a generation or two, then vanish after a drought, a flood, or a raid from neighbors. Another group, miles away, might stumble across a resource and hang on a little longer. The species as a whole survived not because every group endured, but because enough of them did, passing the torch from one to another, like players in a deadly game of ping pong. Scientists call this meta-population dynamics. It means survival wasn't a straight line. It was a network of rises and falls. Think of a patchwork quilt of little human groups scattered across Africa. At any given moment, some patches faded, others brightened. The quilt as a whole remained intact, even though individual pieces were constantly unraveling. It was resilience through turnover. A grim, exhausting form of musical chairs played out over thousands of years. Imagine one group living near a spring. For decades, they survived, raising children, making tools, telling stories. Then one year the spring dried, or a disease swept through, or predators picked them off one by one. The group dwindled and disappeared. To history, it would look like a dead end. But elsewhere, another group endured. Maybe because their refuge still had water, or because they discovered a new food source. Over time, migrants from that surviving group might wander into the abandoned territory, repopulating it, keeping the overall species alive. This pattern repeated endlessly. Birth, growth, collapse, renewal. No group lasted forever, but the species staggered forward through a relay of survival. It was brutal for individuals, but effective for the collective. In a strange way, extinction at the local level was built into the system. Groups weren't expected to last forever. What mattered was that somewhere, someone survived long enough to carry the lineage forward. You can imagine the stories passed down too. Tales of groups that disappeared. Warnings not to rely too heavily on one water source. Lessons about how neighbors had failed and what mistakes not to repeat. Human memory became part of the ping-pong match, helping survivors learn from the failures of those who came before. Knowledge smoothed the rough edges of chance, but luck still ruled. Sometimes groups did everything right and still perished. A fire swept through, or a disease struck, or the climate shifted overnight. There's a dark humor in this. You could be the most organized cooperative band on the continent and still lose to bad luck. Maybe that's why humans developed such a taste for superstition and ritual. When the world feels random and cruel, it's comforting to believe that dances, prayers, or charms can tilt the odds. Yet despite the chaos, the system worked. Like embers passing from stick to stick, humanity stayed lit. The constant turnover kept genetic material flowing. 2. When groups collapsed and survivors merged with others, they brought fresh genes, fresh ideas, fresh sparks of culture. Metapopulation ping-pong wasn't just survival, it was evolution in motion. The churn kept humanity flexible, preventing us from becoming too dependent on one strategy or one place. The remarkable thing is that, through this grim game, humanity never truly disappeared. We came close, closer than most species ever do without vanishing entirely. But the network held, flickering and sputtering, until the climate softened and opportunities grew. From the outside, it looked fragile. From within, it felt desperate. And yet, in the long view, it was enough. So the next time you think of human history, don't imagine a single heroic line. Picture instead a web of groups, each rising and falling, each taking their turn at the impossible task of survival. Some failed, some succeeded, but together they kept the spark alive. We are the descendants not of one band, but of many, stitched together by this endless, brutal, miraculous game of ping-pong played against extinction itself. When we think about survival stories, we tend to picture something dramatic. A shipwrecked sailor clinging to driftwood, a stranded hiker eating moss until a helicopter swoops in, a movie montage of grit and triumph that wraps up neatly in 2 hours. But the real survival of our ancestors wasn't cinematic, and it didn't last a weekend. It lasted 117,000 years. That's not a typo. 117,000 years of waking up each morning and thinking, well, do we have enough to make it through today? It was survival stretched into slow motion, an endless grind of just barely scraping by. Try to imagine what that length of time really means. 117,000 years ago, if you had started a family, and every 20 years a new generation was born, you'd need nearly 6,000 generations to get from then to now. 6,000 cycles of babies being born into uncertainty, of parents whispering warnings about which berries to avoid, of cousins arguing over who forgot to tend the fire. And through all those generations, the story remained the same. There was never abundance, only barely enough. Life in that long grind was not about grand moments of discovery or leaps forward. It was about maintenance. It was about finding the same roots as last season, patching the same hide cloak for another winter, keeping the same fire alive, night after night. Innovation didn't stop, but it slowed to the pace of necessity. When you're exhausted and hungry, you don't invent luxuries. You find ways to do what you already know, just a little better. Maybe you learn that roasting a root for an extra hour makes it easier to chew. Maybe you realize that if you put stones in the fire and then bury them under blankets, they'll radiate warmth through the night. Small, incremental tweaks that turned barely enough into just enough. It wasn't glamorous. Children didn't dream of growing up to be astronauts. They dreamed of growing up at all. Adults didn't worry about mortgages. They worried about whether the waterhole would dry before the rains came. Entertainment wasn't theatre or television, but stories told around a fire, voices carrying the lessons of survival wrapped in the guise of myth. If someone said, "Once upon a time," it wasn't to lull children into sleep. It was to make sure those children remembered how to find food when they were adults. The grind also meant constant vigilance. Every cough was a potential disaster, every storm a possible catastrophe. With so few people alive, each life mattered enormously. Losing one adult to an accident wasn't just tragedy. It could mean fewer hands to gather food, fewer eyes to keep watch, fewer voices to teach children. Death was not just personal, it was communal. Each person carried more weight than they even realized, and every choice, every action, every mistake rippled through the fragile band. Yet despite the constant strain, people found ways to laugh. Humor has always been one of humanity's strangest survival tools. Even in the darkest times, someone likely cracked a joke about how tough the roots were this season, or how Grog once tried to chase an antelope and tripped over his own spear. That laughter wasn't frivolous, it was glue. It reminded people that even when life offered little more than dust and hunger, they were still human. And sometimes, being human meant smiling at the absurdity of it all. The long grind reshaped our species in ways that are hard to measure. Living on the edge for so many generations carved patience into our bones. It forced us to learn endurance, not the sprint of a predator, but the slow, steady persistence of a creature that refuses to give up. Humans became marathoners of survival. Our ancestors learned that the world could be cruel beyond measure, but if you held on, if you kept going one more day, one more season, one more year, eventually the world would change. That's what 117,000 years of just barely enough teaches. Resilience is not a grand, fiery thing. It's quiet. It's the decision to wake up again tomorrow and keep trying, even when you're exhausted, even when you're hungry, even when the odds are against you. Survival wasn't heroic. It was ordinary, repeated endlessly until ordinary itself became extraordinary. And you, lying there drifting towards sleep, are proof of how effective that grind was. Every heartbeat in your chest carries the echo of those who lived with just enough to get by. Every dream in your mind is powered by the persistence of ancestors who never gave up. Even when giving up would have been easier, their grind became your inheritance. Their barely enough became your abundance. After 117,000 years of scraping by, of measuring life in roots and embers, and cautious hope, the world shifted. It didn't happen in a single sunrise, or even in a single century. But slowly, relentlessly, the climate began to ease. Rains returned to parched lands. Grasslands stretched wider, green and rich. Rivers that had shrunk to threads began to swell again. Animals reappeared. Herds of antelope, elephants, zebras. For the first time, in tens of thousands of years, humanity wasn't staring down extinction every morning. And when that moment came, the response was explosive. Small populations that had been clinging to existence suddenly had room to breathe, to grow, to thrive. Imagine a family that had barely been raising enough children to replace itself. Now, suddenly, food is abundant, water is reliable, game animals plentiful, survival stops being a gamble and starts being a given. Children grow up healthy, adults live longer, populations expand. What was once a fragile ember begins to blaze. The speed of the rebound is one of the most startling parts of the story. For over 100,000 years, humanity hovered at the edge of disappearance. And then, almost as soon as the environment allowed, numbers swelled. Within just a few thousand years, a blink in evolutionary time, humans spread across Africa in greater numbers than ever before. The population explosion was like a coiled spring, snapping free after millennia of pressure. With abundance came possibility. More people meant more brains to think, more hands to build, more ideas to share. Innovation, which had trickled slowly during the bottleneck, began to accelerate. Stone tools became more refined, hunting strategies more sophisticated. Fire use became widespread and systematic. People began experimenting, trying new ways of living, because for once, they could afford mistakes. If one idea failed, it didn't doom the whole band. There were backups. There was margin for error. The expansion also changed social life. When the species numbered fewer than 2,000, everyone was effectively a cousin. Now, as groups grew and spread, diversity blossomed again. Bands met new bands, exchanged genes, shared knowledge. Networks formed, stronger and more widespread. Trade began, in its simplest forms: stone from one region, swapped for food from another. Stories carried across valleys, binding people together into something larger than a single campfire. Humanity stopped being a handful of desperate bands and started becoming a tapestry. And yet, the memory of the grind lingered. Even as life improved, the habits of caution and cooperation remained. The long bottleneck had trained humanity to be resilient, adaptable, inventive. Those lessons didn't disappear just because the grass grew greener. They fueled the expansion, turning opportunity into dominance. Humans didn't just spread, they thrived. They didn't just recover, they transformed. There's humor in imagining how sudden abundance might have felt. After generations of chewing bitter roots, someone must have looked at a herd of fat antelope and thought, "We've hit the jackpot." After generations of carrying embers carefully between camps, someone must have realized, "We can build fires anywhere now. Why not 2? Maybe 3? The sheer novelty of having enough must have been exhilarating. Humanity had been starved, not just of food, but of freedom. Now, both returned. The expansion also set the stage for everything that followed. From these swelling populations came the branches of humanity that would split into Neanderthals, Denisovans, and eventually modern humans. From this rebound came the diversity that refilled the gene pool, the creativity that seeded culture, the resilience that would carry us across continents. The species was no longer a whisper. It was a voice, growing louder, echoing farther. It's worth pausing here, though, to remember the fragility of it all. If the climate had not eased, if those refuges had failed, if chance had tilted just slightly the other way, the expansion would never have come. There would be no cities, no songs, no stories, just silence. The speed of the rebound is breathtaking, but its very existence is a reminder of how close the balance was. So as you drift towards sleep, think of that turning point. After endless generations of scarcity, the rains return, the rivers swell, the grass grows, and small groups of humans, tired but unbroken, stand up straighter, breathe easier, and step into abundance. The expansion wasn't just a population boom. It was a sigh of relief echoing across the continent. A sigh that said, "We made it. We're still here." And from that sigh began the roar of humanity that fills the world today. When the bottleneck finally loosened its grip and the human population began to grow, it was like watching a tree sprout after a long drought. From one fragile trunk, branches began to split, reaching in different directions, each shaped by the environments they encountered. From this single, hard-won lineage came 3 children: modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. They were siblings, not strangers. They laughed, hunted, and sometimes even flirted like awkward cousins at a reunion. They were different, yes, but not so different that they couldn't share stories or genes. The first of these children to find their place were the Neanderthals. They wandered north and west, into Europe and the colder reaches of Asia. There, the world was harsh, icy, and unforgiving. Forests of pine stretched across frozen landscapes, rivers turned to glaciers, and winters could last nearly all year. To survive here required adaptation. Neanderthals grew stocky and strong, with barrel chests and powerful limbs. If you've ever looked at a gym full of weightlifters and thought, "I wouldn't want to wrestle one of them," you've just pictured the average Neanderthal. Their bodies were built like survival machines, honed for endurance in cold climates, where every calorie had to be wrung from bone and meat. Meanwhile, another sibling, the Denisovans, headed east. Their territory stretched across the vastness of Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia. They were explorers of extremes. Some Denisovan populations thrived in the thin air of high plateaus, carrying genetic quirks that allowed them to breathe easily where most of us would be gasping. Others seem to have taken to the sea, traveling island to island in Southeast Asia long before boats were supposed to exist. Denisovans were mysterious, leaving behind only fragments of bone and DNA, like breadcrumbs scattered across the continent. And yet, their legacy lingers in modern people, from Tibet to Papua New Guinea. Then, there were those who stayed behind in Africa, the ancestors of modern humans. They were the most restless of the three children, the ones who never quite settled. Africa itself was a patchwork of climates wet and dry, lush and barren, forcing constant adaptability. Instead of bulking up like their Neanderthal siblings, these humans grew lean and wiry, with brains tuned for flexibility. Where Neanderthals specialized in cold and Denisovans in extremes, modern humans specialized in not specializing. Their gift was adaptability itself, but the split wasn't clean or sudden. These three children weren't sealed off from each other. For hundreds of thousands of years, their paths crossed. And when they did, they didn't always fight. Sometimes they mingled. In fact, they mingled enough that if you're of non-African descent, you carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA. If you have ancestors from parts of Asia or Oceania, you probably carry traces of Denisovan DNA too. It's as if those sibling branches reached back and entwined again, weaving the family tree into something far more tangled than neat diagrams suggest. What's striking is how similar these siblings were. Neanderthals made tools as refined as ours, buried their dead, and may have even decorated themselves with pigments. Denisovans, though elusive, clearly mastered survival in places we would struggle to last a day. And modern humans, well, we became restless artists, explorers, and eventually, city builders. All three carried the same flame lit during the bottleneck: intelligence, resilience, and an ability to cooperate. Each expressed it differently, molded by environment, but the core was the same. And yet, in the end, only one child survived. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had dwindled to scattered bands in Europe, Denisovans had vanished into memory, and modern humans stood alone. It wasn't because we were stronger. Neanderthals could have snapped most of us like twigs. It wasn't necessarily because we were smarter. Their brains were as large, sometimes larger, than ours. It was because our restless adaptability gave us an edge. We could survive in deserts and forests, in cold tundras and warm savannas. We could switch diets, invent new tools, form wider networks. We were less specialized, and in a changing world, that was the winning ticket. It's sobering to think that for a long time, the Earth was not ours alone. Imagine standing on a hillside 40,000 years ago, looking out across a valley where a group of Neanderthals tended their fire. They were not aliens. They were people different in build and face, but people nonetheless. And imagine further east, a Denisovan family climbing high cliffs or fishing from an island shore. The world once held three children of the same lineage, each carrying the same improbable inheritance of survival. Only one lineage remains now, but the others are not gone entirely. They live on in our DNA, in our bloodstreams, in whispers carried through the ages. So when you look at your own hands, your face in the mirror, your children, remember, you are not just the child of modern humans. You are also the grandchild of Neanderthals and Denisovans, the inheritor of a family tree that once stretched in three directions. We were never alone. We were always siblings. And our story is richer for it. The strangest thing about human history is that we are here at all. By every law of probability, we shouldn't be. With numbers so low, with so many hurdles in our path, extinction should have claimed us. And yet, here you are, listening, warm and safe, your heartbeat steady. That is the legacy of resilience, the quiet determination of 1,280 people who refused to give up nearly 1 million years ago. But survival came with a price. When our population shrank so drastically, we lost genetic diversity. Compared to chimps, we're practically clones. That's why diseases can sweep through us so easily. Our immune systems are like a lock with only a few keys, easily picked by clever viruses. It's one of the ironies of survival. The very event that saved us also made us vulnerable. Think about the common cold. For all our intelligence, we still crumble before a runny nose and a cough. Neanderthals may have been stronger, Denisovans more extreme, but we inherited fragility right alongside resilience. And yet, our weaknesses are matched by our strengths. We learn to compensate with cooperation, with medicine, with technology. If our immune systems were fragile, we invented healing rituals, herbal remedies, and eventually vaccines. If our bodies were vulnerable, we built shelters, sewed clothes, created heating systems. If the world threw obstacles at us, we found ways around them. That's what resilience looks like. Not invincibility, but adaptability. Humor helps us endure too. Imagine explaining to an ancestor who spent their days chasing antelope and chewing roots that one of our modern crises is Wi-Fi cutting out. They'd laugh until they choked on a beetle. But humor has always been part of survival. Laughing in the face of hardship, finding absurdity in suffering, that's what got people through cold nights and lean seasons. Even now, our jokes about colds, taxes, and traffic jams are echoes of the same coping strategies that once turned hunger and fear into bearable stories around the fire. The deeper legacy, though, is connection. Every single person alive today carries the mark of that bottleneck. Every face you see on the street is a cousin, however distant. Our differences, skin color, language, culture, are just surface ripples. Underneath, we are astonishingly alike. That's not poetic metaphor. It's biological fact. We are one extended family, descended from the same fragile handful who clung to life against impossible odds. And that's the reminder worth holding on to. You are the descendant of survivors. Not abstract survivors in textbooks, but real people who walked the earth, who endured hunger and fear and cold, who carried the fire of humanity through 117,000 years of scarcity. Every laugh you share, every breath you take, every dream you nurture is proof of their victory. You are living testimony that they did not give up. So when life feels overwhelming, when modern problems weigh heavy, remember the absurd scale of your inheritance. Your ancestors faced lions without fences, winters without heaters, plagues without hospitals. They survived long enough for you to exist. Fragile as we are, vulnerable to sniffles and paper cuts, we carry within us a resilience that is almost miraculous. As you drift into sleep, think of that. The last 1,280, huddled together, firelight flickering on their faces, whispering lessons to their children, clinging to hope through endless nights. They couldn't have imagined you lying here with your world of technology and comfort, but you are their legacy, you are their proof. And because they refuse to give up, the story of humanity still unfolds, one dream at a time. And that's where we'll leave our story tonight, the tale of how humanity almost vanished, and how you carry the proof of survival in every heartbeat. Now it's your turn to rest. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let sleep find you the way it once found our ancestors around their fire. If you're somehow still awake, don't worry, just click on one of the 2 videos glowing on your screen and drift deeper into history. And before you go, make sure to subscribe, so you'll never miss another story to dream along to. Sleep well, survivor.